Chapter 4. The door of Duck's apartment closed with a chink. A sound echoed a few seconds later from nearby. Duck glared indirectly at the person locking the door behind him. She turned and started to walk away. Behind her, Fakir's footsteps followed in her wake, and the red-haired girl scowled as she stomped down the stairs. From their apartment, down to the pavement, around the street corner, the young detective, dressed in his pinstripe suit and fedora, would walk a few paces behind her. To the average pedestrian, nothing looked out of the ordinary, simply two people walking in the same direction in the early morning commute. But to Duck, it felt as if Fakir was right behind her, his breath practically rolling down her back. And so, with shoulders hunched, Duck made her way to work with this persistent shadow behind her back. Since he moved in little more than a week ago, Fakir began following her to work and tailing her on her way home every day. In the beginning, Duck had tried to throw him off by leaving her apartment earlier, but he was always already in the hallway, waiting for her. She had even tried to outrun him, but despite her above-average sprinting abilities, even Duck could not run the entire mile-long 8 city blocks to work without stopping to catch her breath. And when she did, Fakir would stroll past her, perfectly composed, while she huffed and puffed on the sidewalk. But that was hardly the worst part of having this prick of a gumshoe as a neighbor, Duck thought to herself as she crossed onto E Street. She recalled the morning when she learned he was moving next door to her as one of the worst mornings in her life.
Ah! I can't believe this!
She had bellowed when she first found out. This being New York City, and this being a small tenant building with thin walls, Duck's outburst did not go unnoticed.
Who was making all this ruckus in the morning?
An angry old lady wearing a mob cap yanked her door open, and though she couldn't see the perpetrators through her squinty eyes, it didn't stop her from letting loose some loud, angry words of her own.
If you're gonna yell, take it somewhere else. The rest of us are trying to sleep, you know.
And with a mighty bang, she disappeared back behind her door, leaving a stunned and embarrassed Duck frozen in place. Fakir didn't seem affected by this episode at all, and reached into his trouser pocket to grab something before holding it out to Duck. Here. He tossed the object to Duck, who nearly dropped it before her fumbling hands closed around the thing. Looking down, she saw a small key lying on her palm, its metallic surface gleaming softly when it caught the light just so. This is the key to my place. If something happens and you need to find me, you can get into my apartment with that spare key. Duck's head snapped up as a blush rapidly spread across her face, nearly matching the shade of her hair and its color.
What kind of man gives a girl the key to his room?
She pushed the key back to him and backed away with her hands raised in front of her.
There's no way I'm going to keep that!
Fakir rolled his eyes. Taking the key, he lifted up the rug at the front of his door and slipped the key underneath it. I'm going to leave it here then, but whether you like it or not, I'm not going to let you out of my sight, he said, fixing her with a look that matched his assertive tone.
I don't know if you somehow got this all screwed up in your head, but I am not the criminal you're trying to catch!
Fakir put his hands into his pockets, and in a voice that clearly demonstrated that he was not the least intimidated or bothered by her anger, said, I'm doing this for your own good. I suggest you make it easier for yourself by accepting things for the way they are. Despite Duck absolutely fuming at him, he continued, If you're going to travel anywhere besides work and the grocer's, I need you to tell me ahead of time. That includes any trips with friends or family, as well as any special errands you have to run. At this point, Duck had just about had it with his insistent demands. Not only has her Saturday morning been ruined by him, he had no notion or respect for her privacy and opinion either. She turned sharply on her heels and walked back into her apartment. Gripping the knob of her door, she craned her neck at him and said defiantly,
I don't have to tell you anything. You're supposed to be a detective, right? If you want to know where I'm going, then figure it out for yourself.
And with that, her door closed with a loud, rattling bang. This had happened more than a week ago, and Duck was beginning to regret making that declaration. Or was it a challenge? The way she did when she did it. Fakir had indeed followed her everywhere, even without her giving him a single clue where she might be going. When she went to the bookshop to pick up a crossword puzzle book, he waited outside the whole time. When she went to get her alarm clock fixed, he was there too, sitting casually at the diner across the street from the clocksmith. Combined with the fact that he would follow her to and from work every day, had Duck been any less exasperated by him, she'd probably find his tracking ability more unnerving than infuriating. The door of the Coton point shoe shop clinked musically as Duck slumped in for another day of work. Outside, Fakir walked past the shop window without a pause in his step. But when Duck looked up, she met his eyes through the glass and scowled at him until he disappeared beyond the window. When she turned back, Piqué and Lilie stood perched on the front counter, watching the whole exchange. Piqué grinned at Duck.
Honestly, I don't see why you're so upset, Duck. I'd be more than willing to have a handsome guy like that follow me everywhere I go. Oh, I sense a battle brewing. Duck, whatever will you do? Piqué is amorous of your secret admirer. Well, maybe not that secret since we all know about it, but still,
Lilie said with visible excitement in her voice. Duck could only groan in response. Ever since she had confronted Fakir across the street, Piqué and Lilie had gotten the idea that Fakir was her flame into their heads. While Duck had repeatedly denied that was the case, her friends either had highly selective hearing or else they simply found the situation too amusing to not keep teasing her about it. Either way, it gave Duck one more reason to resent the young detective.
It's a good thing I didn't tell them he's living next to me, or else.
Duck blushed at the potential jokes her friends would make at that bit of information and quickly stuffed the thought back down. After the chatter about tall, handsome strangers had died down, Piqué picked up a page of newspaper that had been resting beside her arm on the counter.
Say, Duck, have you seen this?
Duck looked at the page Piqué held out to her and saw it was an advertisement for the Macy's Christmas Parade.
The Christmas parade?
Piqué nodded her head enthusiastically.
It's supposed to stretch from 145th Street all the way to Broadway. Lilie and I are planning to go tomorrow, and we're hoping you'd be able to come with us since you missed out on the cafe last time.
Duck mentally grimaced at the idea of Fakir following her through New York City with her friends in tow when an idea struck her. What if he thought she wasn't going anywhere that day? Later that evening, after having bid her friends goodbye, Duck turned her feet towards home. Fakir was waiting for her at the corner of the street, and neither greeted the other in any way as they walked back together, a few paces apart again. Duck didn't stop until she was in front of her door, and there she cast her eyes over her shoulder and glowered at him.
Just how long do you intend to keep following me anyway?
Fakir walked past her to the door of his apartment and took out his own key. However long it takes for this case to go to court. Duck looked at him flabbergasted.
Even on holidays?
Fakir looked at her, then turned his attention back to unlocking his door. Why? Are you planning to go somewhere tomorrow? Standing her ground obstinately, Duck barked back.
What I do on my day off is none of your business.
Well, I've made it my business. Fakir glared back at her, challenging her with his own resolute decision. At his retort, Duck's cheeks puffed up and she yelled,
Ugh! Fine, I'm not going anywhere, okay? At least that way I can have one day without you in my face.
Pulling open her door with far more force than necessary, Duck closed it loudly behind her. Leaning against the door, Duck took a minute to take a few deep breaths to calm her temper. Once her head had cooled, a smile broke over her face, and she knew she was in the clear for tomorrow's parade. Fakir, for his part, had merely rolled his eyes at Duck's brusque attitude towards him. It didn't matter to him what she thought of him. While she had been more aptly an annoying eyesore than a useful eyewitness thus far, he was willing to put up with her knowing it was for the sake of the case he was building. But keeping up with her had not been easy, and more than once he almost lost track of her when she tried to shake him off. Despite those setbacks, Fakir had one thing on his side: persistence. Little did he know that today, on a cold November morning, that persistence would be put to the test. The morning of November 27th was lightly overcast, with the sunlight turned into a hazy glow over the tops and edges of buildings and water towers. Duck opened a crack in the door of her apartment and was delighted to see the hallway deserted. Tiptoeing out, she walked cautiously down the hall, taking care to avoid all the places in the floorboard that creaked. Once down the first 2 flights of stairs, she quickened her pace and made a beeline for the shop where she was to meet up with Lilie and Piqué. Meanwhile, Fakir stood by his window, a cup of coffee in hand. Waking up by the crack of dawn was his habit, and he hadn't had the luxury of enjoying his coffee in the morning since starting his watch on Lake Avenue. However, his peace was cut short when a dash of red ran across the street below him. At first, Fakir wasn't sure what it was that he saw, but in a split second he recognized the swinging braid that trailed out from beneath the yellow hat. Damn! Fakir slammed the coffee mug down so hard he would later find a nice crack in the glaze. Grabbing his hat and coat, he found himself on the pavement half a minute later just as Duck rounded a corner several blocks away, moving towards the point shoe shop. Fakir sprinted after her, but her lead was significant and he could not catch up to her. By the time he made the turn to C Street, he caught a glimpse of Duck and her friends standing in a streetcar before the trolley and its passengers disappeared from view. Realizing it was impossible for him to catch up to her now, he stopped in the nearly deserted street, panting and more than a little angry at the disappearing act Duck had managed to pull on him. Wiping his hand through his sweat-tinged hair, his eye stopped on a figure beside the point shoe shop. Adel stood sweeping the pavement outside her store. She did so leisurely, but from her alert eyes and the tilt of her face one could tell she was very much aware of what was going on around her. And it was so when Fakir walked up to her. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and her hands stopped their work as if she'd been expecting him the whole time. "How might I help you?" she inquired calmly. Though he saw her nearly every day when Duck stopped by the Stein jewelry shop, Fakir was struck by her cool gaze and smooth, even voice. He cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you could tell me where Duck has gone." "And what business might you have with Duck?" Adel responded. "I need to see her. I saw her going off somewhere with her friends. Would you by any chance know where they are going?" he asked again. Adel turned to face him, the broomstick resting in the crook of her right arm as she stood blocking Fakir's path. "I see you following her every day, yet you do not know to where she had gone." The willowy woman studied him. "Just who are you, and why are you so interested in Duck's whereabouts?" Being a cop in New York City, Fakir was not easily intimidated. He'd faced thugs, murderers, and thieves aplenty, yet the woman who stood in front of him made him nervous, like a schoolboy called to stand up in front of the headmistress. Unable to find his voice for a satisfactory answer, he reached inside his coat and held up the sparkling police badge in his palm. Fakir had hoped the sight of the badge would help him get the answers he needed, as most civilians were intimidated by the sight of a police badge, but Adel only studied it with a jeweler's critical eye before seeming to dismiss it. "She saw something, didn't she?" Fakir's eyes grew wide and his shoulders tensed. "How—" he began, but Adel silenced him with a shake of her head. "Duck would never get herself into trouble. The only reason for the police to keep watch over her would be if she had inadvertently become involved in something." Adel's eyes fell, and it was not hard to see from this small gesture that this unsettled the normally composed woman. "That's why I'm trying to protect her." Fakir's voice brought Adel's eyes back to him. "That's why I'm asking you to please tell me where she's gone. If her existence as a witness is discovered, she will be in serious danger." There was a long, protracted silence when neither of them spoke. Fakir realized what was happening now. Adel was judging him. From his research on the people around Duck, Adel had been living here a long time and would have watched Duck grow up. It was clear from Duck's daily greeting that she was very close to Adel, and though Adel wasn't effusive with her affections, it was undeniable that she was very fond of Duck as well. It was only natural that when a stranger started to follow the young woman around, a maternal figure like Adel would be wary of him, Fakir told himself. But the question now was whether Adel trusted him. "They've gone to see the Christmas parade," Adel answered at last, and Fakir let out the breath he had been holding, knowing he had passed her test. "However," Adel looked off into the distance, "the parade route is long, and there will be thousands of people there. How will you hope to find her? Perhaps it is best to wait and hope for her safe return." "She has a point," Fakir's brow furrowed. "But who knows what could happen in the course of one day? If nothing happened to Duck and she returned safely, that would be for the best. But in case something was to happen today, he wanted to know he at least tried to keep her safe." Adel watched him as he debated his course of action with himself. When she saw him seeming to have made up his mind, she smiled faintly and said, "Duck told me she and her friends were planning to take the subway and go to Herald Square. That would narrow the search for you. Nonetheless, it will still be extremely difficult to find her." "I have to try first!" Fakir stepped forward and Adel stepped out of his way. She continued to smile as he dashed down the street on Duck's trail. Once they arrived on the parade route, Duck was glad she was able to ditch Fakir earlier. She, Lilie, and Piquet had spent the last few hours marveling at acrobats balanced precariously on stilts, elephants and giraffes walking in neat rolls, bands playing merry tunes from polished trombones and trumpets, colorful floats and balloons with cheering people in costumes. Now it was nearly noon. The parade was nearing its conclusion, and the crowd was growing restless for the big finale. It was also at this time that Duck felt her stomach rumble, and she was reminded of how early she had had breakfast this morning. A little embarrassed, Duck said to her friends, "I'm getting hungry. How about we get lunch somewhere?" "Huh? Did you say something?" Lilie asked, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd and the parade itself. Raising her voice, Duck yelled,
I said, do you guys want to have lunch right now?
Lilie shook her head, and Pique shouted back,
If we leave our spot now, we won't be able to get a good view of Santa Claus when he arrives. Oh!
Duck settled back into her spot and tried to ignore the growing hunger pain in her stomach.
It'll be over soon, and I don't want to miss the last part after having come all this way,
she thought to herself. But her hunger pain only grew more pronounced, and it became harder and harder for Duck to ignore the pinched feeling in her abdomen. Hoping for a quick bite, Duck stood up on her tiptoes to survey her surroundings. Looking behind her, she saw a small hot dog stand in the building behind them. There were other people there buying and eating food, and the sight of that alone made the rumbling more acute. Giving in to her body's demands, Duck tapped Pique on the shoulder and shouted,
I'm going to go buy some food. I'll be right back.
Too hungry to bother confirming whether Pique heard her, Duck turned and wriggled her way out of the crowd before running up to the stand. Pulling out a few coins, she soon had a juicy hot dog in her hands. Not bothering with condiments, the red-haired girl quickly devoured the food, only to realize she was still hungry. 2 more hot dogs later, and finally beginning to feel like her usual self, Duck turned down the street to rejoin her friends. Only getting out of this crowd was easier than getting back in. Standing on tiptoes again, Duck tried to find her friends where she remembered they had been, but due to her short stature and the thickness of the crowd, she could not make out where Pique and Lilie were. Elbowing her way wouldn't help any if she couldn't even see them, Duck reasoned, and jumped up a few times in another attempt at spotting her friends. A flash of white out of the corner of her eye caught Duck's attention. She stopped jumping. In fact, she almost stopped breathing. Across the street from the hot dog stand, a man in white appeared out of a flower shop, a bouquet of bright red roses in hand, accompanied by a tall man dressed in black closely behind him. Duck's breath nearly caught in her throat as she continued to stare. The man in white wore a hat, the same hat, Duck realized, that she had seen days ago in that dark alley. There was no mistake. These were 2 of the people she had seen that night. Whether it was coincidence or fate that brought her near him again, she could not say, but Duck found herself looking intently at the man's face. As a black Rolls-Royce silver ghost pulled up in front of the men, the man in white lifted his head and the clear sunlight lit up his face, allowing her an unobstructed view of his features for the first time. But the moment ended just as quickly as it happened, when the tall man opened the door of the car for him and he ducked inside, the car door closing behind him. The tall man then climbed into the front passenger seat, and the vehicle began to move away. Duck opened her mouth to call it to a stop, then realized what she was about to do and clamped her mouth shut. Through the backseat window, she could still make out the pale outline of the mobster's head, and hoping to catch another glimpse of him, she dashed across the street, trying to catch the car before it turned onto the main street parallel to the parade route. She ran up to the intersection, but in her rush she didn't turn to see the car coming at her. A sharp, painful tug on her braid pulled her back from the near collision as the car that would have hit her passed her by with a blaring blast from its horn.
Ow!
Duck reached behind her head and massaged her abused scalp before turning to see Fakir, his hand still clasped tightly around the end of her braid.
What are you—
Duck was about to shout, but Fakir beat her to it. What were you doing? Are you trying to get yourself killed by running into traffic?
No, I wasn't!
Duck tugged her braid free from Fakir's hand, suddenly feeling the adrenaline coursing through her after the near accident.
I didn't notice the car coming at me because I saw 2 of the men from the other night.
What? Duck pointed to the silver ghost, which was fast disappearing down the street.
I saw 2 men come out of a flower shop and get into a cart.
Before Duck could finish speaking, Fakir had taken off in the direction she was pointing at. The car had stopped at a red light, and Fakir was just able to make out its plate number before it started up and drove off again, leaving Fakir and Duck in its proverbial dust. Fakir rushed to pull out a small palm-sized notebook and his pen, and jotted down the license plate number as Duck caught up with him. Did you by any chance get a better look at them this time? Fakir asked.
Only the person you call Principe. He has layered white hair to about here, Duck indicated with her hand. And his skin was fair, almost doll-like, I would say.
Doll-like? Fakir frowned. Where had he heard that description before? Duck nodded.
I still couldn't see what color his eyes are, but from the quick glimpse I caught of him, that's what I remember.
Hesitantly, she asked.
But that's about all I saw. He only looked up for a split second, so I couldn't get a very good look.
That's fine. Holding up the notebook with the license plate number, Fakir felt a rush of energy in his veins. But the echo of that doll-like description still nagged at the edge of his mind, like a memory just beyond reach. He pushed the feeling away irritatedly and looked at Duck. With this number, we'll be able to find out who that car belongs to. That'll tell us who Principe's associate is. Duck nodded mutely, and the two of them stood silently on the sidewalk, both waiting for the rush of adrenaline to pass. Finally, Duck said sheepishly,
So, how did you manage to find me?
Fakir glanced at her and snorted. Trying to trick me into thinking you weren't going anywhere for the day, huh? I saw you leave the building from my window and followed you as far as your store. Adol told me you were coming to see the parade at Herald Square, and I came here to look for you. Duck narrowed her eyes.
You must have been a bloodhound or something in another life, because the way you keep following me is uncanny.
Blame your hair, Fakir tipped his chin at her braid. It makes you stand out like a sore thumb in a crowd. I recognized it as soon as I took one glance down the street. Indignant, Duck touched her hair defensively.
Still, you didn't have to yank on it.
Fakir raised an eyebrow. And leave you to get run over by that car? Duck closed her mouth. He was right. If he hadn't pulled her back, she would have been run over for sure, and that's when it dawned on her that Fakir had in fact saved her life. Still miffed about having her hair pulled and being found despite her plans, Duck had to grudgingly admit that if he hadn't arrived at that moment, she would have been in serious trouble. Her mother had always told her to thank people for their help, no matter how big or small, and even though Duck resisted the idea of thanking Fakir, her mother's influence on her was strong, and so in a soft, barely audible voice, she muttered,
Thank you.
What? The noise from the crowd, a throng of cheering voices as the parade came to a close, buried Duck's voice as Fakir strained to hear what she was trying to say.
I said thank you!
Duck bellowed into Fakir's face, which combined with the last crescendo of cacophony from the crowd nearby nearly deafened him. Jesus Christ! You didn't have to say it that loud!
It's your fault you didn't hear me the first time I said it!
Duck accused, not altogether justly. Fakir was about to retort back, but Lilie and Piqué appeared in the dissolving crowd.
Duck!
Lilie waved, while Piqué said,
Where did you go? You missed seeing Saint Nick being crowned. I told you guys I was going to get something to eat,
Duck contested.
Neither of us heard a thing. We thought you had disappeared in the thin air. But it looks like you're simply spending some time with someone else.
Lilie and Piqué nudged Duck in the ribs, twin sly grins on their faces, and Duck suddenly realized Fakir was still there with them.
Fakir and I just sort of ran into each other. Oh, so his name's Fakir. What an exotic name. Is he a young sheik? A prince from Arabia? You must tell us.
Lilie jerked Duck's head toward her and gushed.
I was wondering when you would introduce him to us. You really don't have to keep these things a secret from us, you know,
Piqué said, her voice sounding slightly hurt, which made Duck feel even more awkward and confused by the whole situation. Fakir, on the other hand, observed Duck's interaction with her friend like a bystander observing a car accident, both a little disturbed and yet oddly fascinated by their rapid banter. Deciding retreat was the better part of valor, he tucked the notebook and pen back into his pocket and walked away without saying a word. Seeing him take off, Duck reached out her hand as if she wanted to say something to him before he left, only to realize she didn't know what she wanted to say and let her hand drop back down to her side.
He should have at least said goodbye before he left,
Duck grumbled half-heartedly to herself as their friends continued to talk around her.
Jerk!
In the dim interior of the Rolls-Royce, Muto sat with the bouquet he had bought next to him. The dark fragrance from the flowers permeated the cab of the car, making it feel eerily seductive in its sweetness. Roses, Muto? A deep, raspy voice inquired from the figure seated across from Muto and the custom silver ghost. Muto smiled and reached a finger one of the velvety soft petals. To make up for being away from Rue so often in the past few weeks. I see, the figure opposite Muto said. The man was dressed in a black silk suit and a hat concealed half his face. His hands, large and bony, rested over the top of a walking stick. On his left ring finger, the man wore a large gold ring depicting a raven with bright rubies for eyes and a sharp gaping mouth. You would not have to make up for time lost had the job been done cleanly, Principe. Muto's smile vanished, and his eyes became deathly calm while his hand abruptly plucked the petal he had been fingering from its blossom, balling it up into a pulp in his fist. All the necessary people have been paid off or quieted. Was there more this time? Yes. The black figure's sentence was interrupted by a violent fit of coughs. Muto reached into his pocket and offered the figure a white handkerchief, which the man refused with a wave of his hand. Clearing his throat, the figure said with a wheeze, "But it is not so simple this time. I've just learned that there is apparently a witness to the hit on Alphonse." Muto's eyes narrowed. "Do we know who he or she is?" "No. The police have been very careful with this one, and no one on our side has been able to get a peek at the files yet. But with a little more work and some more dollars, it will only be a matter of time before we get a name." Muto acknowledged this solemnly, bowing his head. "I will take greater care in the future, Father. Please forgive me for my failure this time." There was a long sigh from the aged figure. He reached forward and lifted up Muto's chin with one hand. "If you wish to succeed in life, failure, no matter how small, is not an option. This is particularly true for us in our line of business. You must not hesitate, or else what you want will forever be out of your reach." His eyes closed. Muto leaned forward and kissed the ring on the man's left hand. "I will do as you say, Father, and I will not fail." The next day, Duck and Fakir began their routine as they had for days now. As they walked one in front of the other, Duck found her mind wandering off to different distractions along the way to work instead of constantly fretting over Fakir's presence. Since the parade, she no longer felt edgy having him behind her. In fact, it set her mind at ease, knowing he was watching out for her close by.
Weird,
Duck thought to herself as she made her way to C Street.
Maybe I'm starting to get used to him following me.
So lost was Duck in her own thoughts, she didn't see Adel in front of the Stein jewelry store until she was practically at its doorstep.
"Oh, good morning, Miss Adel,"
Duck chimed. Adel smiled back, and Duck was under the impression that her smile was deeper than usual somehow. "Come inside, Duck. I have something to show you." Duck's eyes perked up at this. Every once in a while, Adel would come across a particularly nice jewel and would show it to Duck.
"What did you get this time?"
she asked as they entered her shop. Adel didn't respond, only walked around behind a counter and pulled out a small jewel case. Opening the case, Duck leaned in over the counter to see a gem. Well, 2 gems, actually, for they seemed to be fused together at one edge. The stones were heart-shaped, with one made out of a rich ruby and the other a spotless diamond. They sparkled beautifully in Adel's hand, and Duck thought it was one of the most beautiful jewels she had ever seen. "The jewel's name is Courage." Duck looked up as Adel spoke. "It is a gem made of 2.
"Do the individual stones themselves have names?"
Duck wondered. Adel gently closed the box and put the jewel back behind the counter. Smiling enigmatically, which only added to Duck's puzzlement, the jeweler answered, "Yes, they do. And someday you will find out what they are, Duck."